Have you ever wondered how a simple children's show could quietly shape generations, influence education, and even stir up scandals that most people never hear about? How does a program that looked so cheerful on the surface carry a history filled with strict rules, hidden pressures, corporate money, and unforgettable controversies? And why does the story of Romper Room, a preschool show that began in 1953, still matter when we think about the balance between entertainment, learning, and business today? Romper Room was not just another children's program. On the surface, it seemed innocent. Smiling kids, cheerful songs, and playful lessons. But beneath that carefully polished exterior was a tightly run empire that blended education, marketing, and a surprising amount of drama. The woman at the center of it all was Nancy Claster, a visionary who believed she had found a new way to teach children. Inspired by how kids learned in real classrooms, Nancy noticed that young children didn't always respond to adults in the way educators hoped. Instead, they learned best by watching other kids. This was a simple but radical idea at the time, and when she brought it to television, executives didn't know what to make of it. To them, it sounded risky. Why put real children on live television when you could just use trained actors who followed directions? But Nancy insisted. She wanted authenticity, she wanted children to see their peers, and she was convinced this would change how young audiences engaged with television. When Romper Room first aired in 1953, it was unlike anything people had seen before. Real children sat in the studio, not rehearsed, not scripted, and most definitely unpredictable. The host acted more like a preschool teacher than a performer, guiding kids through activities, stories, and lessons in a way that felt familiar to parents watching at home. It quickly became a hit, spreading beyond Baltimore where it first aired, and soon landing in cities across America. Within years, it was no longer just a local program but an international phenomenon broadcast in more than 25 countries. Families everywhere recognized the format, a kind, teacher-like host, always called Miss Something, leading a group of children through the daily routine of songs, lessons, and of course, the famous magic mirror. But what most families didn't see was the extraordinary level of control Nancy Claster maintained behind the scenes. She wasn't content to let each station run the show in their own way. She personally trained every single host, making sure they followed the same tone, the same structure, and even the same teaching approach. Only certified teachers could host Romper Room, and before going on air, they were required to go through Nancy's training program. Every detail mattered, from how they spoke, to how they handled a child's interruption, to the exact words they used during segments. This gave Romper Room a feeling of consistency, but it also made the show more than just television. It was a franchise, and Nancy and her husband Bert turned it into a business empire. By the 1960s, Romper Room wasn't only about the show itself. To broadcast it, stations had to buy licensing rights, merchandise, and advertisements from the Clasters. At its peak, the program was franchised in over 150 cities, with hosts carefully molded to fit Nancy's exacting vision. The business strategy was brilliant. While parents thought they were just giving their kids quality educational TV, behind the curtain, Romper Room was a money-making machine. Branded toys, games, and even dishes with the familiar Dub the Bumblebee character filled homes, reinforcing the brand in children's daily lives. The Do Be and Don't Be system, using positive reinforcement rather than punishment, became a cornerstone of the show. Mr. Doobie the Bumblebee was there to remind children of good behavior, and this approach was ahead of its time, especially in an era when discipline usually meant strict punishment. Despite Nancy having no formal background in psychology, experts began to take notice of her methods. Researchers, pediatricians, and educators started studying Romper Room as though it were an accidental behavioral experiment happening in living rooms across America. Johns Hopkins and even the Kennedy Krieger Institute lent support to the program's educational claims, making Romper Room one of the few children's shows to be recognized as not only entertainment but also an actual teaching tool. Yet the charm of Romper Room was also its greatest challenge. Live television with 4- and 5-year-olds was anything but predictable. Children would throw tantrums, get distracted by the studio lights, or simply sit in silence, staring off into space. To manage this, Nancy created a system where children only appeared on the show for about 2 months at a time before being replaced by new kids. The waiting list was so long that parents would sign their children up years in advance, sometimes even before they were born, just for a chance to appear. Selection was not random, either. Kids went through screenings to determine if they could handle the pressures of being on live television. Those who were too shy, too energetic, or unable to follow directions were rejected. In the conservative climate of the 1950s, this was framed as a way of ensuring discipline and order, but it also highlighted the hidden pressures of keeping a polished front for an audience of millions. Hosts, too, faced tremendous pressure. They weren't just hired based on their looks or charisma. They went through extensive interviews, personality tests, and weeks of training. Miss Fran from Wichita, for example, was chosen from hundreds of applicants, but even she had to spend 2 weeks training under Nancy in Baltimore before being allowed on air. If a host didn't live up to Nancy's standards, they were dismissed without hesitation. And yet, despite the uniform training, Romper Room was not always consistent across different locations. Some stations followed the Baltimore model faithfully, while others adapted it with local changes, translating scripts, adding new segments, or sometimes ignoring the rules altogether. This meant that a child in New York might have a slightly different Romper Room experience than one in California, even though they were watching the same franchise. One of the show's most beloved features was the magic mirror. Every day, the host would lift up a mirror frame, look through it, and recite a rhyme before calling out children's names. I see Jimmy, I see Susan, I see Michael. For kids at home it felt magical. Their name might be called, making them feel seen and special. But behind that simple moment was an enormous responsibility. Hosts had to memorize dozens of names pulled from hundreds of letters sent by children and parents. Forgetting a name or mispronouncing it risked disappointing a young viewer who had been waiting eagerly by the TV. It was a small detail, but it made the host's role even more emotionally demanding. By the mid-1960s, Romper Room had become one of the most widespread children's programs in the world, broadcast by over 100 stations. It wasn't just entertainment, it even partnered with the President's Council on Physical Fitness and the Department of Education, adding credibility and national visibility. The show's reach extended beyond television into an entire line of merchandise, toys, and games that blurred the line between teaching tools and product sales. While parents saw educational play, critics later pointed out how much of the show was cleverly designed advertising, pushing products into the hands of children through trusted hosts. But even a show as wholesome as Romper Room wasn't immune to controversy. In 1962, one of its local hosts, Cher Chesson, faced a devastating public scandal. Pregnant with her 5th child, Cher had taken a drug called thalidomide, imported unknowingly by her husband from Europe to help with morning sickness. At the time, the risks were not widely known in the United States, but tragically, the drug caused severe birth defects. Cher was forced into a traumatic and very public ordeal, including an abortion abroad, which was incredibly taboo in the early 1960s. She faced death threats, protests, and eventually lost her job. The FBI was even called in to protect her family. For a children's show that had built its brand on morality, innocence, and wholesome family values, this scandal was a harsh reminder of how quickly the public could turn, and Romper Room never fully recovered from the backlash. Even in later years, the chaos of live broadcasts kept creating memorable stories. A young Leonardo DiCaprio once appeared on Romper Room and later claimed he was kicked off for being too disruptive, including slapping cameras and interrupting story time. While the host later clarified that no child was ever officially removed, it's easy to imagine the spirited young Leo being redirected off camera. The story became part of his Hollywood mythology, showing just how unpredictable the show could be. To handle these disruptions, Romper Room developed a series of secret signals and strategies. Camera operators could quietly shift focus, while standby psychologists were present in case a child had a meltdown or refused to continue. But disruptions weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they were as innocent as preschool crushes, where a child would refuse to participate unless seated next to their favorite playmate. These small but real dynamics made live episodes far more complicated than they looked on screen. By the early 1970s, critics were also beginning to question how much of the program was really about education. An investigation by Action for Children's Television revealed that nearly half of the show's content revolved around pushing toy sales, often disguised as playtime. Behind the smiling hosts and cheerful lessons, Romper Room was turning children into unwitting advertisers for Hasbro and other sponsors. As the years went on, the cracks in the franchise became more visible. Some stations ignored Nancy's strict training model, hiring inexperienced hosts who lacked teaching backgrounds. Others cut corners in production, creating shows that looked sloppy and less educational, undermining the credibility of the brand. By the 1980s, the shift toward puppets and pre-recorded segments under the new title Romper Room and Friends signaled the end of the original magic. The once interactive program lost its personal touch, especially when the iconic magic mirror greetings no longer felt genuine. The decline continued through the late 1980s, though the show made one important milestone in 1987 with Sharon Jeffrey becoming the first and only African-American host. Still, ratings kept slipping, and by 1992, Romper Room ceased production altogether. Reruns lingered until 1994, officially closing the chapter on a remarkable 41-year run. For many, the show lived on as a nostalgic childhood memory. But looking back, Romper Room was never just a cheerful preschool program. It was a carefully constructed empire, a laboratory for child behavior, a marketing powerhouse, and at times, a lightning rod for controversy. The legacy of Romper Room lies in how it reshaped what children's television could be. It proved that kids didn't need actors in costumes. They connected best with peers they could relate to. It demonstrated that educational television could also be profitable, though not without ethical concerns. And it left behind a complicated story where the innocence of childhood entertainment was deeply intertwined with corporate ambition, strict control, and cultural pressures. Whether remembered fondly or critically, Romper Room holds a unique place in television history, reminding us how powerful, and how complicated, children's programming can be. And now it's your turn. If you enjoyed learning about the hidden history of Romper Room, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more fascinating stories from behind the scenes of entertainment history.